This is a difficult story for me to tell you, but I think it's important for you to be informed. There is something in the mountains in Montana. I don't know what it is, but I know it's deadly. My story starts back in the early 80s. My father had recently lost his job. My father then moved our family out to Montana in hopes for a new beginning. The land price was incredibly cheap, which allowed my father to buy a couple hundred acres of land. The land that he purchased seemed untouched, as if we were the only humans to ever see this part of land. My family initially did not have enough money to build a house, so we stayed in a trailer on the property. The conditions weren't terrible, except it was difficult for me and my family, considering my older brother Brian had special needs. Brian had a hard time speaking, which made it very difficult to understand what he needed. He would also sleepwalk every night. His sleepwalking was very bad. There were times that we'd often find him the next morning, a couple of miles away. Over the years, my family has concluded the best way to keep track of Brian was to make sure that he wore an anklet to bed that had bells on it, and to keep all the doors and windows locked. Now you can kind of understand the difficulty of staying in a trailer with someone with this condition. Needless to say, my family was pretty anxious to start building a house on the property. Brian, for the most part, was a great brother. He was completely harmless and loved to laugh. He loved animals, especially the wildlife, and he'd get very excited when he saw an animal outside. Things seemed to change when we moved to Montana. It seemed that Brian no longer wanted to go outside, and he definitely didn't want to go near the woods. During the day, Brian seemed to be fine for the most part, but at night, he seemed to get very agitated and would point off into the woods, saying something that we couldn't understand. We would check with a flashlight, and of course, never saw anything, but Brian would still feel disturbed. The woods didn't really bother me. I knew for the most part what kind of animals were out there, so I wasn't too scared. However, on some nights, I did feel this weird feeling of something dreadful out in the woods, just barely out of my vision. Whenever Brian was having one of his episodes is when I felt that dreadful feeling coming from the woods. It was almost as if Brian could sense it too. Things were like this for a couple of weeks, but everything changed one day when I took Brian out into the woods to go hiking. Brian and I had been cooped up inside that trailer for some time. Brian and I had hiked a solid hour into the woods. The land was quite beautiful. During the first part of our hike, it was as if I had the old Brian back. He didn't seem to be spooked about the woods at all. During our hike, we found a couple streams and rivers, and Brian was able to see a couple deer. Instead of going back, we decided to keep going deeper and deeper into the woods. This was a huge mistake. The deeper we went, the more I noticed these weird scratches on these trees. Normally, I would think that this would be deer rubbing antlers on trees, but this was different. There were only 3 marks, as if something with talons were scratching the trees. The marks looked deep. Just when we were about to turn back, Brian started pointing at something. I looked at what Brian was pointing at, and to my surprise, there was a huge cave that led into the hillside. "Hey, good find, Brian," I told him, but Brian seemed upset. Instead of wanting to investigate, Brian wanted nothing to do with the cave. Brian started to get agitated, and I had to calm him down. I started to feel that dreadful feeling coming from the cave. At this point, Brian and I decided to head back, but right before we left, I could have sworn I saw something inside the cave move. I couldn't exactly be sure, but it looked like a set of red eyes looking at me. Instead of sprinting off into the woods, leaving Brian behind, I decided to play a game with him, and I told him, "Hey Brian, first one back to the trailer wins." We both ran back to the trailer in record time. Thankfully, I don't think Brian knew what I saw. While we were running, however, I would glance back every now and then, just to make sure that we weren't being followed. There were a couple of times where I thought I saw something, but I couldn't be sure. I definitely did not want to stop to get a better look. When we finally made it back to the trailer, I made sure that Brian and I stayed inside. I told my parents what I saw, but I don't think they believed me. But then again, I was also pretty unsure of it myself, and obviously, Brian couldn't back me up on this. This is where things began to escalate. That night, I remember waking up to Brian having one of his episodes, waking up everyone. He was pointing out the window in absolute terror. There was something outside that was terrifying Brian. We didn't have any external lights on the trailer in order to look around. My parents figured it was just Brian sleepwalking. Typically when Brian sleepwalks, we can get him back to bed quite easily. But Brian didn't seem to want to calm down. We covered the blinds and made sure Brian was calmed. That took some time, but obviously we got him to bed. We woke up the next morning to an interesting sight. Just outside the trailer were these weird footprints that circled around the trailer. It looked as if someone was crawling around all night. Initially, my parents thought it was Brian that was somehow able to escape the trailer last night. But after a quick review of Brian's feet, that obviously couldn't have been the case. The prints were very strange, and they looked almost human. It almost looked like someone was crawling around on their hands and feet, except the hands and feet were exceptionally large. The suspicion quickly went from Brian to perhaps a crazy person that happened to know where we lived. If that was the case, it would be quite a comical prank, if this was left at that, but it wasn't. My parents seemed to be uneasy about this. They didn't like the idea that someone was circling our trailer, and I don't blame them. Whenever I looked out into the woods, I'd always get this bad feeling, and I think my parents felt it also. Instead of wanting to go out and play in the woods, Brian and I just stayed inside for that day. We felt safer inside. That night, I remember waking up to a strange sound. My first thought was that it was Brian sleepwalking around the trailer, but after further review, Brian was fast asleep and the sounds were coming from outside. It sounded as if something was being scraped on the outside of our trailer. Of course, it was the part of the trailer that didn't have any windows. Not thinking much of it, I decided to open the door and go outside, but right before I opened the door, my father grabbed me. "Don't open that door," he said in a very stern voice. My father was clutching a shotgun, and he looked terrified. "I got a glimpse of it," he said. My father's eyes were wide, and he looked serious. "I don't know what it is, but it's not human." I was about to speak, then my father cut me off. Well, I thought I heard something outside, and I thought it was Brian. But after seeing Brian on the couch, I decided to go and investigate. I was able to peer through the windows and get a glimpse of it. The thing was very pale, and it walked on all fours. I didn't get a look at its face, but just by looking at its limbs, I could tell it wasn't human. The creature that my father was describing matched the description of the creature that I saw inside the cave. A sense of dread had just washed over me. I think that whatever it was had followed me from the cave to my trailer. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but I do remember waking up and looking outside. On all the trees near the trailer were these 3 scratch marks that looked similar to the ones that were near the cave. There were also some scratch marks on our trailer. This thing had very sharp claws. After seeing all of this, as well as seeing the creature, my father took very little convincing into moving the trailer. He moved it to the other side of the property that was much farther away from the tree line, and from this new location, we experienced no activity from the creature. My theory was that it liked to live in the woods in order to hunt and to be concealed from the daylight. That would explain the pale skin. While we were on the other side of the property, my family was able to build a house over time. This took about 5 years, but it was well worth the wait. The new house that we had built allowed each person to have their own room. This was able to give me a normal sleep schedule, and I barely ever heard Brian sleepwalk. The more years that went by for Brian, his sleepwalking got worse. If anyone ever left the door unlocked, we would find Brian some decent way away from the home on the property. I remember the morning waking up finding my mother pacing around the kitchen frantically. My dad and Brian were nowhere to be seen. I was able to put 2 and 2 together and figure out what had happened. Brian had sleepwalked the night before, and someone left the door unlocked. My dad was out searching for him. Typically, we found Brian pretty quickly in the morning, but today, we couldn't find him. I went outside to help assist my dad finding Brian. It didn't take me very long to find him out on the property. Remember, we had a lot of acres, so searching for Brian could take some time. I helped search the majority of the property with my father. After searching for some hours, we finally reached the part of the property that we had been with the trailer that many years ago. My father and I searched quickly. We didn't want to stay there very long. That's when we heard it. We could hear the bells on Brian's anklet ringing. Brian must have been close. The ringing was coming from deep inside the woods. My father and I had to place our fear aside in order to find Brian. We slowly crept inside the woods, looking for Brian, following the sounds. My father and I could hear the bells off into the distance. We followed the sounds, ignoring the dangers that were nearby. I began to feel that dreadful feeling again. As we were walking in the woods, my father and I came across a terrible sight. There was blood all over the ground. There was no body of any animals nearby. Naturally, my father and I thought the worst, but we didn't say anything to each other. "Something very terrible has happened here," my father said. We could still hear the bells ringing off into the distance. There was still hope that Brian was still okay. We continued to follow the bells until it led us to its final destination. The bells had led us to the cave. The cave was bigger than I remembered. It looked much bigger and much darker than before. I was about to walk into the cave before my father grabbed me by the shoulder. "Hey, we don't know what's in there," my father said grimly. I shook my father's hand off my shoulder. "Of course we know what's in there. That's Brian. That's his bells," I told him. My father and I began to argue at the mouth of the cave. While we were arguing, the bells had stopped ringing. My father and I then peered into the cave, expecting anything to emerge. We heard the bells slowly get closer. Instead of being excited, I felt this extreme dread, as if the impending doom was coming out of this cave. We then heard screeching. My father and I immediately bolted out of the area. The screeching continued. We continued running until we were out of the woods. Whatever it was that was following us did not leave the woods. We went back to the house silently. It was as if both my father and I knew the actual outcome of Brian. We got back to the house and my father called the police. I talked to my mother, telling her that the trail of Brian went cold. She was pretty devastated. The police came about 2 hours later, and my father led them to the area in which we thought Brian was. He had led them to the mouth of the cave. The officers entered the cave with their weapons drawn and flashlights. They were in the cave for about 5 minutes before they quickly returned. They told us that the cave was littered with animal bones. They said that this was very common for a bear cave. One of the officers reached into his pocket and pulled out an object. The object rang like Brian's bells, except they were covered in blood and were tattered up. The officer asked, "Does this mean anything to you guys?" My father solemnly nodded his head. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange, human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact, as most of online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York State and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remain powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from the upcoming book. A Suicide Note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage my guilt or pain I have introduced to this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once, I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again, I awoke and heard his voice, and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. "Dearest Lenny, I prayed for you. He spoke your name." A journal entry, translated from Spanish. 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They're hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. His voice. A Mariner's Log, 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again, at the request of the Rake. From a witness, 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip from Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he got out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knees almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed, and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion right along the side of the bed until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds, just looking at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hall leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before hurting my children. When I got into the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouched and hunched over about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter, Clara. The creature ran down the stairs, while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured, and only spoke once more in her short life. She said, "He is the Rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night, while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They did not survive. Being a small town, the news got around pretty quickly. The police were pretty helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was neither published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers, myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now refer to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any detail, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages and never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the record at 8 times the normal speed. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and I now believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I've not seen the rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while he slept. I know in fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. In 2006, I was living in a small town in Utah where I used to manage rental properties up in the mountains. The events I'm about to speak of are not covered by the news. The people that do speak about these events are often labeled conspiracy theorists and not taken seriously. At the time, my business was growing quite exponentially. The more my business grew, the more rental properties I was able to make deeper and farther up the mountain. The people loved the properties. Something about being secluded up in the mountains was very attractive to people. Everything was going fine until one day I got a call from one of my workers. He said that he was clearing land on a new property that we just purchased and saw something strange. At first, he said that he thought it was a mound of dirt, but upon further review, he saw that it was something more sinister. The mound of dirt turned out to be a mound of flesh. The mound was comprised of skin and bone of animals. There's no animal that I know of that would do this. This must have been a person, a very sick and demented person. Why would he leave a mound of skin and bone out in the middle of the woods? I told my worker to remove the mound and get back to work, which he hesitantly did. I showed up at the site about 30 minutes later. The site was pretty deep into the woods up into the mountain, deeper than I've ever been. During the build at this location, I'd have workers tell me that they've seen something in the woods, stalking them. This could have very well been a cougar, which are quite popular in this area. I told my workers to be alert at all times, and for all project managers to carry a firearm. This property was trouble from the start. For whatever reason, I had builders and construction workers quit on me, saying that they didn't feel safe this far into the mountains. This was silly to me. I used them in all my other properties before, and they didn't have any issues. They kept saying something to me about a presence in the mountains, something watching them. I was finally able to hire a contractor that was able to finish the property. He did a pretty decent job, although he was kind of expensive. I was able to find tenants for the property, and I continued building other locations. 3 properties later, I get the same call from a different worker, saying that they saw a mound of flesh in the woods. I remember what had happened last time, and I told him not to touch it, and that I'd be right there. A part of me didn't believe what I was hearing. There's no way there's a mound of flesh just sitting out in the woods. I figured he was exaggerating. But sure enough, when I showed up, there certainly was a mound of flesh. The smell was terrible, but the bugs were probably worse. Sure enough, there was about a 4-foot mound of flesh that someone placed out in the woods. I debated with one of my workers that maybe this was a gut pile of a larger animal, but that still wouldn't explain the organization of the flesh into a pile. Predators up in the mountains typically eat most of the animal. This mound seemed to be comprised of 4 different animals, all compiled into one. The skin that had been removed looked almost surgical, as if someone did it with a razor's edge. Instead of removing the mound, I told my worker to contact the police. Nothing came of it, but I just figured it'd be a good idea to get something on record. This new property was different from the last one. Something about the atmosphere was more intense. It was as if I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, as if there was a part of the forest that was forbidden. At this point in the story, I started getting calls from tenants, mainly the newer ones, saying how their pets have gone missing. They wanted to know if there were any predators in the area, and I told them no. That was an obvious lie. I then started getting reports about people peering into windows. Like I said before, the area is pretty secluded. The reports were that there was a pale man peering into windows, but only at night. Things started to get more serious when actual tenants went missing. We only found that they went missing since they were not able to check out at one of the properties. These were the same people that claimed that there was someone peering into the house. I contacted the police and told them what had happened. They went up to the property and collected what evidence they could. There was not much that they could do. The police told me that they figured that they just went hiking up in the mountains and got lost. To be fair, that is a probable explanation. I continued to rent out properties. I acted as if nothing had happened. I suppose that is wrong of me. But there was no way for me to know what was going to happen. About 2 months later, I started getting reports about a pale man walking around on all fours out in the woods. He would be seen just outside of homes, peering in and out of houses. At the same time, tenants would go missing. This was the point I was starting to put the two connections together. It was as if the houses that he was peering into, those people would go missing. I contacted the police again, except this time, rather than the police, a government agency came out and investigated. They came out in unmarked vehicles, and with heavy weaponry. They came and stayed at one of my properties, in hopes to find some of the missing tenants. They asked me permission to reinforce the entryways to the buildings. I agreed, as long as they kept me updated on what was going on. 2 weeks in, and I get a disturbing phone call late at night. I am told that I have to remove all of my tenants on the mountain out of the houses. I asked for a further explanation and asked to meet up in the morning. I go to one of the homes at which the investigation is taking place. The agents are waiting for me outside. Outside the house, there are these huge crates that are labeled hazardous. There was about 4 of them, and I was not able to get a great look at them. The agents then told me something very disturbing about the mountain. They were able to disclose that they found the missing tenants. They were found in a meat pile not too far away. They then told me something that I'm not sure that I believe. They told me that these attacks were caused by rabid bears that lived in the mountain. All of my time working here on the mountain, I'd never seen a bear once, so I'm not sure what I believe. They also told me that I was not able to rent out any properties on the mountain anymore. This was quite devastating. I pressed them for answers as to why I was not able to work anymore and what actually happened on the mountain. They told me that the information was classified. Before the agents left, one of the agents said something to me that keeps me up at night. He said, "Whatever these things are, there's more than one of them."